Hello, everyone. I'm Anna.
And I'm Kevin.
We are PhD students at the University of Washington. Today, we're excited to share with you our work on understanding users' needs for counterfactual explanations in everyday recommendations. This work was advised by Chirag Shah. I will begin by introducing the background and motivation of this work. I believe that most of us are very familiar with the influence of recommender systems on the content that we see in everyday applications like Facebook, Netflix, and Yelp. Nowadays, most online service platforms have adopted automated recommender systems to suggest personalized content based on people's activities and latent interests. Some of the commonly seen explanation types in everyday applications include item-based explanation and user-based explanations. In this Netflix image, the TV shows are suggested because they're similar to a show that a user has watched. In the bottom Amazon example, the headphones are suggested based on similar users' activities. In recommender systems, explanations for why not questions are rarely seen. From social science literature, Miller has found that when people are asking why questions, they're often asking a why not question in the form of why P but not Q. The explanations to those questions are called counterfactual explanations. Prior work has also shown the usefulness of answering why not questions in high-stake application domains such as automatic loan application approval or medication prescription. In a few recent works, researchers have also proposed the use of counterfactual explanations in relatively low-stake domains, such as recommender systems, to increase trust and create a more personalized experience. This type of explanation is desirable because it can contrast what is suggested to the users versus what is not shown to them. This enhances the level of transparency in algorithmic profiling without disclosing any of the recommender system's inner workings. Question-driven frameworks have been widely used in understanding people's explanation needs, as an explanation is fundamentally an answer to a question. In this work, instead of focusing on the explanation side, such as feasibility of generating counterfactual explanations and how such explanations should be presented, we focus on eliciting when people would ask why not questions and whether providing explanations can support their information needs. We used a question-driven approach to probe into people's counterfactual explanation needs. Moreover, since a counterfactual explanation essentially serves to explain a why not question, we will use why not explanations and counterfactual explanations interchangeably in this work. Based on the literature review, we identified the following research gaps. First, prior work mainly studied counterfactual explanations for algorithmic decision support in high-risk domains such as finance, healthcare, and criminal justice. But there is limited work for counterfactual explanations in recommender systems that mediate everyday tasks and practice for average users. In addition, prior work that focused on recommender systems are mainly algorithm-centric and theoretical. Despite work in philosophy and social science literature that demonstrated the usefulness of counterfactual explanations, there is little empirical work investigating users' needs for such explanations in the wild use contexts in recommender systems. A better understanding of when and how people seek those explanations would offer valuable insights in designing explanatory features to support users in understanding alternative and missing recommendations.
With this in mind, we asked the following research question that drives our paper. When do people need counterfactual explanations when interacting with recommended content in everyday intelligent applications? In pursuit of this question, we conducted a series of studies to find out more about the use of conventional and counterfactual explanations in everyday online applications, with the goal of identifying user needs for counterfactual explanations in those scenarios. To help with the design of subsequent studies, we first conducted a preliminary survey to get some initial insights on participants' general explanation needs. Based on the findings, we then designed a semi-structured interview to understand what is missing from existing explanations and what triggers people to ask why not questions. Lastly, we conducted a survey study to hone in on a hypothesis that emerged from one of our interview findings, which was that decision utility impacted desires for counterfactual explanations. All of the studies focused on recommendations in everyday intelligent applications, including e-commerce, social media, and point of interest applications. More details about these studies can be found in our full paper. I'll now quickly walk through the overview and findings from our preliminary survey. Going into the survey, We wanted to answer a question that would be important for further investigations, and that question is, why do users want explanations? We surveyed 91 participants on this topic on the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform, or MTurk. The main portion of the survey consisted of 3 scenario-based questions where participants were asked whether and how they would use explanations from the recommender systems in each scenario. From the survey, we found that there was generally high interest in consuming explanations in everyday online applications in areas such as social media, point of interest, and e-commerce. And this was particularly noticeable in e-commerce platforms. Participants identified several reasons why they would want explanations, but the most common one was to make better decisions when selecting a recommended item. In light of this, we focused on understanding how counterfactual explanations can better aid decision-making going forward.
Now I will introduce the interview study. The semi-structured interview was driven by 4 sub-research questions. These questions are inspired by prior work studying explanation needs in low-cost intelligent systems. First, we want to understand how people are interacting with existing explanations. Do they actively seek for those explanations? How are explanations being used in their decision-making? Then we want to understand whether people want better explanations and what information is missing. After that, we elicited when people would ask why not questions and seek corresponding explanations. We recruited participants who regularly use online service platforms such as e-commerce sites, social media applications, and multimedia streaming services who have noticed and interacted with recommended content. We interviewed a total of 12 participants online via Zoom. We transcribed and coded the data from the interviews using open coding techniques and affinity diagramming to identify common themes. We found that many existing explanations are not noticed. Participant 10 realized there are already explanations in those platforms that they just usually skip over. And participant 4 passively notice explanations and sometimes don't even notice. Most participants mentioned a lack of relevant details in existing explanations. One participant mentioned that they found Facebook only provides super vague explanations without disclosing the crucial factor for its recommendations. Participants also mentioned that why not explanations would be more appealing if the perceived benefits of making a decision were higher. Participants 3 states that they wouldn't necessarily explore why not explanations for Spotify, as the cost of listening to a song is lower compared to other decisions. Here are the takeaways for the interview findings. We found that participants typically do not actively look for explanations all the time. However, this does not mean that explanations are not useful in everyday recommendations. In fact, we found that participants generally expressed a need for more relevant and detailed explanatory information to aid their decision-making. Lastly, the perceived utility associated with decision-making is a main factor affecting people's needs for why not explanations. And our work did not end here.
Coming out of our interviews, we wanted to hone in on the last point there about explanations and perceived decision utility. Our interview sample was quite small, so we wanted to see if our observations would hold on a larger sample. To this end, we launched a survey study on MTurk investigating whether significant differences in desires for counterfactual explanations exist when we vary the decision utility. To help us define some terms here, we draw from behavioral economics literature, which outlines 2 utility concepts. We have decision utility, which refers to the utility signal perceived during the decision-making process. And we have experience utility, which is perceived at the end of a decision-making process after the person attains and evaluates the outcome of a decision. In this survey study, we intend to answer this sub-research question. How does utility, both decision and experience utility, associated with decision-making affect users' needs for why not explanations when choosing from a list of recommended items? To answer this, we conducted a within-subject survey study using 2 different scenarios to test and quantify potential correlation effects between decision-making utility and users' why not explanation needs. The premise of both scenarios is a typical usage of a point of interest application to find a restaurant. The first scenario, represented by the burger, involves a casual meal, which should be associated with a lower perceived utility. And the second scenario, represented by the plate and utensils, is to find a restaurant for a special event, which should be associated with a higher perceived utility. Here are the independent and dependent variables of our study. We'll also point out that here we separately measured the 2 different potential outcomes of experience utility. Negative experience utility is measured by how dissatisfied one would be if they were to make a bad choice, and positive experience utility is measured by how satisfied one would be if they were to make a good choice. We ran a t-test to see whether participants' perceived utility are different across the two scenarios. The p-value of all the variables are less than 0.01, suggesting that all measures are significantly different between the special event and casual dining scenarios. And for all the variables, the mean rating is higher in the special event condition than the casual dining condition. Based on this result, to further establish the relationships between the independent and dependent variables, we ran an ordinal logistic regression on each pair of variables. Here we want to point out some of the most salient findings from this correlation matrix, and we'll further elaborate on their implications in the discussion section. So first, all but one of the pairs of variables have a positive and significant correlation. The positive experience utility has the strongest correlation with user action. The correlations with user action is among the highest in dependent variables. And lastly, correlation with dependent variables are not symmetric for negative experience utility and positive experience utility. So what do our findings mean? Our survey showed that there is an overall significant and positive correlation between decision-making utility and why not explanation needs. This expands on and provides further evidence on top of prior work suggesting that people tend to ignore explanations when the perceived benefits are uncertain. Additionally, we find it interesting how the perceived utility at different stages in the decision-making process led to different needs for counterfactual explanations. Specifically, the effects of positive and negative experience utilities on explanation needs are not symmetrical. Having higher perceived benefits of choosing a good option leads to interest in learning about missing and alternative recommendations. As we heard from our interviews, participants ignored explanations they saw in their everyday apps at times. One possible reason for this is that many interactions on these platforms are optimized for quick and short-term euphoria. But if there is a high benefit associated with, say, finding a good restaurant, then the user may be more interested in understanding what is missing and why they're not seeing other options. Along with previous work on behavior changes based on risk versus reward, we think risk and reward mechanisms of human decision-making can complement the study of explainability in recommender systems. And while we found correlations between utility variables and explanation need, the high correlation with user action points to the fact that instead of seeking explanations, users may be more inclined to directly take actions to refine the search results. And this calls for a reconsideration of whether in some scenarios providing explanations is really the best solution.
To wrap up, in this work, we elicited people's needs for counterfactual explanations when interacting with everyday recommended content with an empirical question-driven approach. Our findings have implications on the future design of decision utility-aware, user-facing recommendation systems. We will now outline several promising avenues of future research. We have identified some factors that may influence desire for counterfactual explanations and how users may leverage them in their decision-making process. But in order for these explanations to be deployed in real-world systems, we need to explore methods for displaying these explanations in user interfaces in easily understandable ways. Future research can explore prototypes with different display methods to better understand their effectiveness. Counterfactual explanations can often contain much more information than conventional explanations. This can impose a higher cognitive load to users. Higher cognitive load under model uncertainty can decrease user trust in a recommender system. Previous work has also derived techniques to decrease cognitive load in conventional explanations without increasing uncertainty. So it's important to explore how these techniques can be transferred to counterfactual explanations. Finally, it appears that decision utility impacts the desire to interact with counterfactual explanations. How can recommender systems take decision utility into consideration and intelligently decide when to show counterfactual explanations to a user? This opens up many interesting questions around measuring decision utility and using it to improve recommender systems going forward. If you are interested in learning more, please refer to our full paper for more details. Thank you for listening.